Welcome to the Faster Podcast by FLO Cycling, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything that makes you faster on your bike. This is episode 33, and today we have muscle oxygen sensor manufacturers HUMON joining us on the show. During this episode, we'll discuss what muscle oxygen is, how it's different from power and heart rate, and how you can use it to become a faster cyclist. Hey, this is Chris with FLO. When we're not producing this podcast, our team at FLO is designing some of the fastest carbon fiber bicycle wheels in the world. As a thank you for being a listener of our podcast, Faster by FLO, we wanted to offer you 20% off your next purchase of wheels at flocycling.com. Head over to our website and pick up a set of wheels to make you faster at your next race or ride. Simply use coupon code PODCAST, that's PODCAST, in all uppercase letters when checking out to get 20% off your order. Thanks again for listening to Faster. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, Dan and Alessandro, welcome to the show. How you doing today?
Very good. How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Very, very good. Very excited to have you guys on the show today. The first time I saw HUMON, that's how you say it, right? It's HUMON, right?
That's right.
Okay, good. It's a lot of people say human, and I always try to correct them that it's HUMON. So I was at Interbike, actually, and you guys had a booth there, and I walked around. I saw these people with these sensors on, and it was displaying all these colorful graphs on an app, and I learned about it. And since we started this show, we've talked a lot about power. We've talked a lot about heart rate, and we had a coach on the show who had mentioned muscle oxygen, and I started doing some research on it and looking into it, and it's really an awesome way of measuring your intensity in a different, unique way. So I wanted to have you guys on the show to talk all about muscle oxygen today and get the best information we could from the experts. So where are you guys based?
We're based in Boston, in Cambridge, just next to Boston.
Okay, cool. And how long have you guys been doing this this muscle technology?
It's been about 4 to 5 years. We were back in school at MIT, and then we started kind of developing the technology. But we've been on the market just for about a year and a half, a bit more than a year and a half.
So you guys both went to MIT and started this there?
Yeah, well, Dan went to the real MIT. He can tell you more about it. I went to the MIT Business School.
Amazing. I was just actually in that area not too long ago, and that is a very, very beautiful campus. I was really jealous when I walked by it and thought, man, I went to school on an old hill in Canada where it snowed all the time, and you guys have that beautiful river. It's amazing. What a great spot.
Well, we get our fair share of snow out here too. So
yeah, well, at least you got a pretty river to look at.
Yeah,
so, yeah, cool.
All the snow days keeps us focused and inside studying and working hard. So
there you go. All right. Well, let's just start with some general information on muscle oxygen. So can you just tell us what muscle oxygen is as a basis?
Yeah, sure. So muscle oxygen is looking at the amount of red blood cells within a volume of muscle tissue that are carrying oxygen versus those that are not.
Okay. Awesome. And how do you measure muscle oxygen?
Great question. So most of your listeners and probably most people out there are familiar with pulse oximetry. They've gone to the hospital, they've visited someone in the hospital, seen the thing that, they clip on your finger. You can buy them on Amazon, for $20. And that technology leverages the underlying principle that blood changes color based on how much oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin in those red blood cells. And this is apparent too, if you're cold, if you drink alcohol, your extremities visibly change color. So it's this kind of fascinating underlying principle, and we leverage that same idea, except for in the case of the pulse oximeter, which is looking in the arteries to get a sense of the oxygen supply. We're looking within the capillary bed of, in this case, muscle tissue. To get more of a sense of this balance between the supply and the demand.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Okay, and do you guys measure total hemoglobin as well?
We do. That's an underlying measurement that our system captures, but it's not something that we report in the software now. It's reported as the amount of hemoglobin in the blood. Which is what you might get, if you go get a blood test at the doctor.
Okay, so you're collecting that as you're measuring, but you're not displaying it anywhere for the user.
Well, so there's just kind of a translation done to say, how much hemoglobin is in the tissue versus how much is actually in the blood. And I think that was done kind of in some underlying protocols that are standardized and allow the transmission of this information. And I think that was done to just give people a metric that they were more familiar with.
Okay.
Something that, again, they can say, hey, when I go to the doctor, it's whatever, 12.5 grams per deciliter. I kind of know what that means. So there's a bit of a translation there. But essentially, at the end of the day, it's the same information. And when asked about that information, people sometimes will say, hey, your thing said 11, and I'm worried that that's a little bit low. It should be better than that. And the most important thing when we're looking at that information is the changes over time, because that gives us, and I'm sure we'll get more into that later.
Okay, cool. So let's just compare it to some other technologies for measuring intensity, and I'd like to go through a few of those just to see how muscle oxygen compares to the heart rate and things that people know the most. So why don't we start with heart rate? And heart rate lets you know how your heart is responding to exercise. So if you know your maximum heart rate, you can get a rough idea of your training zones and based on your heart rate. So how does muscle oxygen compare to heart rate, and what can muscle oxygen tell us that heart rate cannot?
Again, good question. So heart rate is giving us information about the supply side. And that's really it. And it makes sense, right? The faster your heart pumps, we're circulating, presumably, assuming that the pulmonary system is working effectively. You're circulating oxygenated blood throughout the body. What it doesn't tell us is what's happening to that oxygenated blood when it reaches, for example, the muscles in the legs that you're recruiting during cycling. And that's really, I think, what the athlete is more concerned about. And that's what muscle oxygen is going to tell us.
So heart rate tells you how the blood's getting there. It doesn't tell you what it's doing once it gets there, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So let's go to power now. So power lets you know how hard you're pressing on the pedals, basically, but it really doesn't give you any information about what's going on inside of the body. So if you know your FTP, you can build training zones. So how does muscle oxygen compare to power, and what does muscle oxygen tell us that power cannot?
So, power is great in one way because it's just very raw. It's an external measurement. 200 watts is 200 watts, and that doesn't matter if you're Lance Armstrong or Joe Blow that climbed on the bike for the first time yesterday. And that's what's, I think, great about it. What it doesn't tell us anything about is how the body is responding to produce, for example, that 200 watts. Are you producing those 200 watts at a level that's sustainable? If you're having difficulty producing 200 watts, why? What is the physiological limitation that's preventing you from doing that? And those later things are some of these questions that muscle oxygen is helping us to answer.
Okay. So if the heart rate is telling us kind of about the supply side, is there a way that you can use muscle oxygen and heart rate together, or is muscle oxygen on its own enough? Do you need heart rate?
Well, I mean, we think muscle oxygen in and of itself is an incredibly valuable metric. And there's, I think, some new research coming out that's showing, especially for the vast majority of kind of your average, maybe unconditioned individuals, that if you had to pick a metric to prescribe training in a safe and effective way, that the muscle is where the limitation is going to be found. And so for maybe 90% of the people, that is going to be the more effective metric. Now, presumably your listeners are all performing at a much more elite level than that. They're a lot more trained. They're a lot more conditioned. And so in those cases, there's definitely going to be value in both. Okay.
So muscle oxygen really is letting us figure out what's going on inside of the body as we're training, or inside of the muscle as we're training. Some coaches have used blood lactate in the past to get an idea of what's going on inside of the body. So are muscle oxygen and blood lactate telling us something similar? And if not, does muscle oxygen, do we really need blood lactate if we have muscle oxygen?
Yeah, I don't want to jump and say, one thing is right, the other is wrong, and make everything black and white. What I will say is that, like, first off, nobody cares about lactate because they're fascinated with the biochemistry of this, thing that someone discovered in milk in the 1800s. What they want to know is how is lactate being, that's the means to the end. How can I use this piece of information to efficiently and effectively prescribe training? Now,
Okay.
Lactate is giving us insight into, when we think about kind of the three basic energy systems, it's giving us a little bit of an understanding as to where we fall on that spectrum. And that's essentially one of the same questions that muscle oxygen can help us answer. So at kind of that fundamental level, we're getting a lot of insight into the same question. I think the bigger thing and the more interesting thing to look at here is the practical limitations of lactate. We've been doing this for quite a while now. We've done a ton of tests, and I can't tell you, in the early days, there was not a finger that I didn't have that wasn't looking like Swiss cheese and full of holes, and from all the experiments we were doing. But the point is, even for people that have the budget, they're training at an elite level, going out there and doing these tests are just almost prohibitive for most. Like, they're just not going to do them. And with muscle oxygen, well, in some ways the information is going to be a little bit different. It's getting us, down to that same kind of fundamental problem in a way that's real time. It's non-invasive. It's easier to use than strapping on your heart rate monitor. And I think that's kind of the more exciting aspect of it, is even if you considered the underlying data to in some way be equivalent, 99 people out of 100 are going to go with the muscle oxygen, not having to go out and buy these strips and prick their fingers and all that stuff.
Okay, so you think that you can get most of the information that blood lactate tests can give you with muscle oxygen?
I think that's
99% of it.
The 99% is the 99% of people are going to prefer the solution that's non-invasive. Where there's 99% of the value, I would say, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the information. Muscle oxygen can provide a lot of that. And there may be a little bit of kind of very specific insight that one or the other would give that the other wouldn't.
Okay. So Jurg Feldman, years and years ago, he's a sports scientist, which I'm sure you know who he is if you're in this industry. He developed something known as the lactate balance point test. Are you familiar with what that is?
I was actually only vaguely familiar about it prior to just recently. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll give a basic description for the people listening. So you basically do a ramp test to failure, which gets your blood lactate to spike really, really high. And let's say you finish that ramp test at 300 watts. Well, then you cut your intensity down to 50%. So now you're at 150 watts, and you do another ramp test on the way up. So at 150 watts, your body is able to clear blood lactate. So essentially, if you ended the test at 10 millimoles, your blood lactate will fall in the first step. And then you go from 150 watts, maybe to 160 watts, and you ramp back up slowly. So at one point, as the intensity of the second ramp kicks up, your lactate stops falling, it turns around, and it starts climbing again. And that bottom out point where it changes from dropping to climbing again is known as the lactate balance point. Do you feel that with a muscle oxygen sensor, you can find that point?
So to be honest, that is not something we've tried. I think the underlying information is there to where if that was the problem that we set out to solve, can we find the lactate balance point? I'm confident we'd be able to do that from the data that's hiding inside of muscle oxygen. And, when I had done just kind of some recent research on the lactate balance point test, it seems like it has fallen a little bit out of favor since it was proposed about 10 years ago. But this underlying idea that the lactate balance point, you're looking to identify these like metabolic shifts, and you're looking to identify this homeostasis or this equilibrium. Again, that's the same kind of thing that we're looking at with muscle oxygen. Like where is that on that spectrum of that energy, those energy systems. Where are we falling? What's sustainable?
Perfect. Okay. And then my last question on comparing to other technologies is people use metabolic carts for measuring things like their VO2 max or looking at where they start, if they're burning carbs or sugar. So can muscle oxygen tell us anything about our VO2 max or give us any insight to whether we're burning carbs or sugars for fuel?
Yeah, so I would say
fat. Sorry.
Yeah, I would say a similar answer to before, in that the underlying data I think is there. This whole transition that you get on these met carts as you're transitioning across this energy spectrum. You're transitioning from using glucose to using or from using fat to more glucose as the effort increases. Those are things that are underlying captured in the data. Now, similarly to lactate, actually going into the lab and doing the VO2 max testing, it's available. People do it. We've spoken to a lot of our users who have done it before, but a lot haven't. And they're out there looking for the same value or the value that they might get from these sorts of lab-based tests, but without having to go to the lab. And at the end of the day, that's the problem that we're trying to solve, if that makes sense. The VO2 max is the means to an end. Like nobody, maybe except for the purposes of bragging rights, and comparing, to your friends and see who's higher. At the end of the day, what you want to do is be able to translate that information into an effective training program.
Okay. So do you feel that the muscle oxygen allows you to find a distinguishing point between whether you're burning fats or carbs? Is there any way that it can show that?
Yeah. Implicitly through, again, this transition. So when we're in kind of, burning glucose, we're using the glycogen in the muscles, we're going to expect that system is going to be, further away from the anaerobic system and the reliance on oxygen and fats. So, we've never looked at it from the perspective of, can we nail down exactly where that transition is based on the data that's being provided? But these kind of inflection points in the oxygen curves in the data that's provided will tell you exactly that.
Interesting. Okay, very cool. Let's talk about training zones, because you guys have a slightly different system than your standard 7 zone system by Coggin or things like that. So you have a specific test for determining muscle oxygen zones. Can you describe that test to us?
Yeah, so it's not so much that the test that we provide determines the zones. The zones are set up and ready to use out of the box, and I think that's a very important distinction, and also something people are not used to. Now, When we take a step back and even look at or think about heart rate zones and the value that they provide, in many ways, I think the best way to make those zones useful is kind of nailing them down and kind of quote unquote personalizing them to you. Now, I think the common kind of thing is set your threshold heart rate or your max heart rate to 220 minus your age. And then, and there's other flavors of that formula, but it's usually pretty simple. And then there are other formulas to calculate what your lactate threshold heart rate is from your max heart rate. So maybe 88% of your max heart rate is your threshold heart rate. And from that, you nail down this spectrum of zones that is fixed in terms of a number, a heart rate, 100 to 115, and so on. Sure. Now, the biggest challenge there is nailing down those zones. And in many cases, we've found in doing tests kind of internally, massive improvement from using other ways to nail down those zones, whether it's via, invasive testing like lactate, VO2 max, or whatever. But essentially once, and that was kind of the goal of all this lab-based testing before, right, is nail down your zones. And then once you've tailored your zones, use the heart rate monitor that prescribe or that can measure this stuff in real time and use that while you're training. Now, to get back to your original question about the muscle oxygen zones, these are not fixed thresholds. We're not going to say 70% muscle oxygen is zone 3, or whatever it might be. That's less important than, again, getting back to this balance of supply and demand and essentially bookkeeping that over time is the way to think about it. And that's how our zones work. So we have 4 zones. We have green, orange, red, and blue. And green represents this balance between supply and demand. Everything is in homeostasis. You should expect to be able to perform at these effort levels for sustained periods of time. And as you increase the effort level and you slide across our energy system spectrum up into, using glucose and stuff like that, you'll shift from green to orange as we're tipping that scale in the demands for oxygen exceeding supply, and ultimately into red, which is a severe deficit between the demand and supply. So these are things that will work out of the box based on kind of this balance for everybody.
Okay, so if we try and, that's an excellent answer, but let's try and simplify this for, to just make it simple. So green for you would be, we obviously use oxygen as fuel to fuel our muscles, right? So I'm walking down the road, I'm a relatively fit person, I can supply enough oxygen to my muscles for that effort. So I'm in the green zone, right?
Perfect, exactly right.
Okay. My next zone is you said orange?
That's right, yep.
Okay. So orange is kind of where is it the supply is equaling the demand?
This is just where we've started to tip the balance, where demand starts to exceed supply.
Okay, so now I've gone into a jog or maybe a relatively quick run, so maybe a 5K pace, and my muscles are requiring more oxygen than my blood can provide. Is that fair?
Exactly right.
Okay, now red is where I'm doing a 100-meter dash. I'm sprinting as fast as I can, and I'm going to burn out in 10 seconds. Well, if I can get there in 10 seconds, but 15 seconds is all I have. So the supply of oxygen is far less than the demand that's needed.
Exactly right. Perfect.
Okay. And where's blue?
So blue now is on the other side of the spectrum. This indicates active recovery. This indicates when supply is exceeding demand. So this is something that's incredibly useful, not only for example, during recovery rides, but also very helpful for prescribing intervals.
Okay, so I've done a hill repeat. I've gone red. Okay, so I'm way taxed. And then instead of using a 20-second recovery interval or a third of the effort as the recovery, you're saying I could look at this monitor and say, when it's blue, it's time to go again?
So what you would wait is you would, after this intense interval, you've gone deep into the red zone, you're highly anaerobic, you stop the interval, and you see that transition to blue as the heart rate's elevated, you're supplying oxygenated blood that exceeds the demands. Now, what you want to use that information for is when to begin the next interval. And in most cases, I would say that involves waiting for the blue to turn back to green, waiting for us to get back to homeostasis, and then begin the next interval.
Very interesting. Okay. So let's talk about we're going to talk about delivery and utilization. Okay. So on the delivery side, we talked about that earlier, but that's your heart's ability basically to pump oxygenated blood to the muscles. Okay. So can you talk a little bit about that and any other factors that would reduce oxygen delivery in the body? So is that a fair assessment of the whole thing, or is there more to it than just your heart pumping blood to the muscles?
I think that's the big one that we're looking at. I think other factors that we've seen a decent amount, especially more recently, would be, for example, altitude. Given a certain capability of your cardiovascular system, of your respiratory system at sea level, that is going to change when you go to altitude. That's going to affect your ability to provide oxygenated blood to the muscle.
Okay, so your heart's doing the pumping, right? That's a limiter. How much oxygen is in the atmosphere is obviously one with elevation. Is there a component where your body is either efficient or inefficient at getting oxygen from the lungs to the blood? Is there a component in that as well?
I mean, for sure there is. Obviously there's all kinds of factors that could affect your body's ability to extract oxygenated blood from the air. We haven't looked at those closely.
Okay.
But there's certainly, for example, like anemia. If somebody's anemic, if they have, a low concentration of hemoglobin, they are just simply not going to be able to extract the same volume of oxygen from the atmosphere, irrespective of their muscles' ability to effectively use whatever oxygen is being supplied.
Okay. All right. So now let's look at the side of the equation where we're using the oxygen at the muscle. Okay. So that's typically limited by the muscle's ability to absorb the oxygen, right? Is there anything else that goes into that?
I mean, yeah, that's it. That's what we look at. The muscle's ability to absorb oxygen. Usually the first thing that comes up is mitochondrial density.
Okay.
And not only the effect that has, but more importantly, if we've identified a physiological limiter and we said, hey, your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, you're supplying all the oxygen in the world that your muscles need, you're having a problem extracting that, the question becomes, how do I train to improve mitochondrial density? Another factor could be capillary density as well. How do I increase the density of capillaries within muscle?
Okay, cool. So those are my next questions, actually. So let's say we have an oxygen delivery limitation. So our hearts, our lungs are not pumping enough oxygenated blood to the muscles. What are some specific workouts that an athlete can do to improve their body's ability to deliver oxygen?
Yeah, so I think your kind of more traditional of just aerobic exercises is the standard solution to the delivery problem.
Okay.
And often when people reach out and say, hey, I've identified a limitation, what should I do to fix it? We're often hesitant to prescribe to people, via email or phone or whatever it might be, exactly how they should be training. And there's a ton of information out there that obviously the athlete is going to have to tailor to their needs, to whatever works for them. I think the much more fascinating part of this question is the fact that you've already gotten to the point where now you can understand the limitation. Like that, having had the ability to put your finger on it and say, now I know that I do have an oxygen delivery limitation. And then two, I'm sure as time goes on, now that we have the ability to see and put our fingers on these limiters, we'll learn a lot more about how to effectively train them.
Okay, so before I ask you how you fix a muscle utilization or an oxygen utilization problem, let me ask you, how does the HUMON device detect whether we have a delivery or utilization problem? How does it do that?
So, if we get back to this idea of thinking about the underlying metric measuring the balance of supply and demand, what we want to see in an athlete as for example, the effort or the intensity is to go up, we want to be able to see sufficiently elevated oxygen levels as the power increases, as long as possible, indicating we're supplying enough oxygen through these increasing power levels. But what we also want to make sure is that sufficiently high power levels, ultimately the athlete is able to desaturate. And if, for example, you get to the end of a step test and you absolutely, just push as hard as you can and really, go after it on the bike, and we don't see that athlete's ability to desaturate, that tells us right away there is a consumption problem. Like your muscles have been supplying plenty of oxygenated blood to the muscles, and it's a factor of those muscles not being able to utilize it.
Okay, awesome. So we know that aerobic type exercises or workouts can help us with the oxygen delivery. If we're having an issue using the oxygen once it gets to the muscles, what type of workouts can help improve that?
I think now HIIT is becoming quite a popular way designed to stimulate mitochondria. Our focus has been less so in the past couple of years in closing that loop And that's kind of what we're focusing on going forward, is now that we're able to get this underlying measurement, and we're, seeing people try different workouts that are designed to attack these different limitations, processing and crunching all that data that we get to see, hey, is the HIIT workout that we prescribed to a user or that a user adapted based on the data, is that working? Are we seeing that limitation go away based on that training? And then you can also see, zone 5 kind of workouts designed to increase, the capillary density in muscles as well.
Okay, very cool. So is it safe to assume then that if I don't have a muscle oxygen sensor, there's really no way for me to know if I have an oxygen delivery or utilization limitation?
Exactly. And you might try to infer it from your heart rate monitor, what your power is telling you, but you're in the dark.
Okay, very interesting. All right, because everyone is so familiar with Andrew Coggin's standard 7-zone system, I want to talk about how your zones compare to that system in some way. So let's just start by asking you if your zones correlate with his 7 zones in any way.
So they don't line up in that I can't tell you, green is zone 4, orange is zone 5, and red is zone 6 and 7. What I can tell you is that they lie across and they span exactly the same spectrum.
Okay.
And I think it's important to kind of, when thinking about these zones, is that, the number of zones that we have is like somewhat arbitrary. Like there's not this discrete scale where things are like snapping. I like to really think about it as like we're spanning this energy system spectrum. And, 7 is a good amount to break it down. And we could certainly think about refining our zones in the future to kind of increase the granularity and align more closely with some of the existing stuff down there. But we kind of took this approach from simplicity's perspective to span that same spectrum, but with a few less zones.
Okay. And I'm assuming that where the zones would line up in relation to the Coggin 7-zone system would be unique for each person, or is it relatively the same for each person?
So it's going to be the same in that the colors of the zones represent that athlete's kind of transition across this spectrum. Now, of course, when you make that transition between green to red, that might be at a completely different power level than somebody else. So
but they're happening physiologically for everyone at about the same point.
Exactly. Yep.
Interesting. Okay. So let me ask you this. If green, I'm going to make an assumption, and I could be way off, but let's say that green is anywhere from a recovery effort all the way up to somewhere in the tempo zone. Okay. And I want to go do a long weekend ride. I'm training for an Ironman. I'm going to go do a 5-hour ride. I'm guessing that I would do most of that ride in the green zone. Is that fair?
So there, I would stick our blue a little bit at the bottom of the 7-zone scale and say blue definitely encompasses 1 and maybe would cheat a little bit into 2. And then, and what we're looking for there is you're doing this recovery ride, which is the amazing information that muscle oxygen can provide you. Is the whole point of this recovery ride is to increase oxygen and nutrient delivery to the muscles to speed up recovery without overutilizing the muscle and, essentially doing more harm than good. And when we look at muscle oxygenation, what we want to see at least is you hop on the bike, you're cold, you just got out of bed, it's 4:30 in the morning, you hop on and you start riding, and we want to see this very nice and gradual increase in oxygenation. Typically I think for people, they're looking for about a 10 to 15% increase from their kind of baseline resting levels. And then we want to see you hold it there. And if you go out and you have your Strava turned on and your favorite song is playing and you warm up after 30 minutes and you start, getting anxious and putting out a little more power than you should be for that recovery ride, we'll see it. We'll see you start tipping down instead of having this like very fully oxygenated 10 to 15% above your baseline. You're going to start seeing that cheat and have that go down.
Interesting.
So that's kind of where the blue would fit into.
That would be
scale.
Recovery, right?
Exactly.
Okay, now let's say we're going to do an aerobic ride. That's kind of the green zone?
Exactly. Yep.
So how do we know if we're at, like, green zones or aerobic zones can span, right? So how do we know if we're at the bottom of the green zone or the top of the green zone? Because you can use them for different things. Is there a way that you visually see that?
Yeah. So, if we think back to kind of like the at a very high level, obviously like the calculation of the zones is pretty complex, but it really, the easiest way to think about it is bookkeeping this balance between, supply and demand. And so when you're trying to understand in the green zone what's going on, just like in that example I just gave you, of if you're increasing effort during a recovery ride and you start cheating and essentially going faster than you should, you will see that oxygen level start depleting. And if you see kind of this steady decline in oxygen level, or these levels that are lower than what you'd expect, it may never transition you into the orange zone, but it's going to kind of give you a way to stratify the green zone a little bit bit yourself. But it does require a little bit of human interpretation there.
Perfect. So as well as getting a color, are we getting some type of number that we're reading when we're doing this?
Yeah, I mean, and I should have probably mentioned that before. Is when we went back to the very beginning and said, what is muscle oxygen? And it's this, how many red blood cells are carrying oxygen versus those that are not. Exactly, that number is reported as a percent. So in the same way that your pulse oximeter, your SpO2, is going to tell us if we're otherwise healthy and everything is working fine, say 98%, muscle oxygen is going to tell you a percent as well. And that might be at rest. It might tell you 75%. And again, we color that number with the zone because, we knew that the biggest limitation for people, despite the just massive value that the underlying data has, is that I'm sure, some of your listeners have never heard of muscle oxygen before. And if we were to put this metric out in the world, people aren't going to know. They're going to have all the same questions that you've been asking us today, which is,
right.
How do I use that information? And so that's kind of where the color, the zone, is laid on top of that underlying information. But of course, there's a ton of information beyond just the 4 zones that's kind of buried in that data.
Okay. So as the user, I can see that I'm in green, and I can also see my muscle oxygen percentage, the saturation percentage.
Exactly right.
So then I know, so is the top of zone, the end of the green zone before I switch to orange, is it the same percentage roughly for everybody?
It is not. So that is where this transition is based on this bookkeeping of the change in oxygen level over time. So what I'm less concerned about is if you're in the green zone and you are going for a steady, sustained effort, relying predominantly on the aerobic energy system.
Correct.
I'm less concerned if it's going to tell me you're at 70% or 75 or 65 or whatever it might be. What we want to see is that you can sustain that level over that extended period of time. And what's happening if we're seeing that that's not the case? Are you gradually depleting the oxygen? Are you unsustainable or operating at an unsustainable intensity?
Which would suggest I've gone at an intensity that's too hard for the physiological adaptation I'm after.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay. Last question on comparing to other systems, I guess. You can look at, there's the ventilatory turn points. They call them VT1 or VT2. They're used in polarized training. Everyone's talking about it. Is there any way to connect muscle oxygen to these turn points, VT1 and VT2?
Yeah. Again, as kind of before with looking at lactate and thinking about these different energy systems, the information is there. Now, we have not in the product had a lot of demand for people saying, hey, I need to know my VT1 and VT2. It's more about kind of getting down to your 7-zone system and figuring out along that spectrum where they line up. But I'm highly confident if the problem was tomorrow, all of our users reached out and said, I want to know VT1 and VT2, that we'd be able to go back, crunch the data, which we have a ton of, and figure out exactly where those are, and that would not be, the most difficult problem for us to solve.
Okay, that's really, really cool. All right, let's talk about some of the unique benefits that muscle oxygen can offer. So as we go through a training cycle, we fatigue, and our FTP and our max heart rate can change a fair amount, as the cycle of training changes. And it's nearly impossible to know what our FTP or our max heart rate is at any given time. So that means, what was a zone 2 effort during week 1 of a training block could be maybe a zone 3 power effort during 6 week of a training block. So muscle oxygen helps fix this issue because it can see what's going on inside of the muscle during exercise. That's my assumption anyway. Can you talk a little bit about that and this unique advantage of muscle oxygen?
Yeah, so I think your assumption is 100% fair. We do always keep in mind that there is obviously a little bit of different information contained in heart rate versus muscle oxygen. So if, for example, these things are changing, our FTP is changing, and we're not 100% sure why, this is going to give us obviously the other half of that oxygen supply utilization problem. It's going to give us the other half of that picture. And I think more importantly is that when we think about these problems with zones or where we fall in zones changing over time, that's because we're so used to and so fixated on the fact that zones are defined based on a fixed heart rate, or a fixed power level. And again, with the zones that we're providing based on the muscle oxygen, they're not a fixed number. And so we expect these to kind of adapt automatically and always be personalized to you. Because again, if your power is 20 watts down from what you expect in your FTP and you're not sure why, well, all of the same rules governing energy systems and the balance between supply, like all of those rules are still going to hold.
Interesting. So if you're fatigued and you're 20 watts down, we don't know that. But physiologically behind the scenes, supply and demand will never really change.
Well, the importance of them being balanced will reflect itself in the results of our test, or imbalanced. So,
and that's, maybe I didn't phrase that well, but what I'm saying is muscle oxygen, you're either going to be, excess supply, balanced, or decreased supply, right? So you can see that regardless of whether you're fatigued or not.
Exactly.
Okay, very interesting. So we talked a little bit about recovery intervals before, but coaches typically prescribe the length of recovery between intervals based on a percentage of the interval time. But muscle oxygen obviously lets you see when your muscles have actually recovered. So can you talk a little bit about how muscle oxygen makes this possible, and if using a muscle oxygen sensor makes interval training more effective? So we talked a little bit about how that happens. You can see when the blood or the oxygen supply is in excess, but does that make our interval training more effective?
The short answer is yes, for sure. Now, the longer answer is, and this is always kind of the answer when people, might ask, how do I do something, or how do I train, or what should I be doing? Obviously, that depends on goals. And having this visibility into, in this case, what's happening during intervals, I think is fascinating, because now we can tailor them. Why are we prescribing the recovery times the way we were before? And what is the benefit of, for instance, maybe changing these? So one really interesting example is, and this is also a segue into other use cases beyond cycling, for example, but is if we want to focus on, say, hypertrophy and muscular endurance versus, say, maximal strength. There is a strong case in the former to prevent a full recovery before starting your next interval and maintaining a state of hypoxia. In the same way that if we're focused on maybe maximal strength or more explosive power, we want to make sure we get a full recovery. So
interesting.
Basically, that time may vary a lot, and there's of course no one way to say every time you want to wait until the blue turns back into green, although that's a very standard use case and a very standard way to prescribe intervals. With the information that you get, there's also ways to prescribe intervals in different ways to meet different goals.
Which you really can't do with any other system, can you?
No, you're guessing.
Okay. Okay, so the other question athletes usually have is, okay, so the coach prescribes, 6 1-mile repeats for a bunch of runners. And by doing that, if you have a whole team of runners, you're assuming that the same prescription works for every runner on the team. But in some cases, one runner may be more fatigued than the other, and maybe the perfect prescription for them that day was 4-mile repeats versus 6. So does muscle oxygen allow us to see when it may be time to cut the workout short, or even suggest that we shouldn't do 6, we should do 8 because we have more in the tank that day?
Yeah, I mean, this is an awesome problem, and one that I think at least we underappreciated in the beginning, which is I think a lot of people are concerned with making sure they're getting out there and they're training hard enough. When in fact, I think the overtraining is almost just as big of a problem. Are people out there? They should not be doing 6 or 8. They should be stopping at 4 and not knowing that and doing more harm than good. And so, yeah, muscle oxygen gives us a great way to look at, if we're out here and we're looking at, transitioning back and forth through the different zones, our muscle oxygen level is rising and falling as we're doing these intervals. If after the 4th interval, we are not recovering back to that baseline level, that's a great cue to us that, hey, something's going on. You're not recovering back. We should not, now we're in this territory of deconditioning. We're doing more harm than good.
Okay, that's really fascinating. And what would suggest that maybe we should do an extra interval?
So if we're seeing great recovery, if we're seeing a fast recovery and a full recovery, so fast, I mean a rapid influx of oxygen, this abrupt transition back into our zone, our blue zone, this rapid transition back into blue, and a sustained recovery period where the oxygen level elevates itself back up to those baseline levels or higher, that tells us, hey, everything is good. Let's keep going for it.
Interesting. That's really cool. So we talked a little bit earlier about recovery rides and how the blue zone is good. We're seeing that we're getting an excess supply versus demand. Is there anything else that muscle oxygen can tell us during a recovery ride that power or heart rate or RPE cannot? Something that would suggest maybe we need an extra day of recovery, or maybe we can go harder that day?
So I think we kind of touched on the most important thing there, which is making sure we're doing what we need to fully oxygenate the muscles, ensure that we're providing nutrient delivery, and focusing on recovery without overexerting ourselves, which I think is the common problem. Like we mentioned before, just getting out there, getting a little bit overzealous, pushing a little bit more than we should, and negatively impacting that recovery ride. I think what's an interesting kind of corollary to this is, in the same way that we think about this oxygenation, this 10 to 15% rise we often see beginning a recovery ride, is how that affects warm up. And this has been a huge one that we've seen that I don't think we fully expected at the beginning, which is, in the same way you want to train lightly, you want to oxygenate, you want to dilate the capillaries and get the blood flowing, as we say. You want to do the same thing before really any workout. You want to make sure that you're getting ready for high and sustained power levels, and that's something I think people have overlooked in a big way. And by looking at this increase in oxygen level, we can see warm up. And what we've seen is that many people do not spend nearly the amount of time that they should to, again, get the blood flowing.
Wow.
We've seen a lot of changed user behavior when they see this and they say, oh my gosh, it takes me not 5 minutes to warm up, sometimes 20, and I think we've seen even as high as 30 minutes. So people have really adapted and made these dynamic protocols where they, again, instead of just saying, I'm going to do 5 minutes followed by a couple light intervals, they're going to say, okay, I'm going to tailor this protocol to get a maximum blood flowing before beginning.
Crazy. So what is it that you see when you're warmed up? What happens to the saturation or the color? What are you seeing?
So we want to see some blue in there usually. And we want to see that oxygen level rise and plateau without kind of ever really decreasing too much. Because obviously, when we see a decrease, that's telling us, hey, we're using a little bit more than we're supplying, and we want to make sure that we're supplying more than we're using, and really focus on getting that supply side primed, dilating the capillaries, getting everything warmed up and flowing before we start increasing the demands.
Okay. So when I'm out riding, running, whatever I'm doing, does this data, does it display to my Garmin? Do you guys have a connection with Garmin where you can see that?
Yeah, so we have a data field that's, it's pretty much, I think we support nearly every Garmin device. So yeah, you can just turn the product on, download the Garmin data field, the data will go there. And then, if you want to have Strava on your handlebars on your phone, we're on iOS and Android as well.
Okay. And what do I see on Garmin? I see a number, the muscle oxygen saturation, I think you said, and then a color?
Yep. You get the number and the color.
Yeah, that's really cool. Okay.
Exactly right.
Let's talk about how we can use muscle oxygen for racing, pacing a race, basically. So let's start with an Ironman, a long distance race, a 100-mile mountain bike race. How do you use it in that situation? What's a best case scenario for that?
I think it just gets back to thinking about during these races, whether it's 100 miles or a 400-meter sprint, where we want to be on our energy system spectrum. So in the case of the former, the 100-mile race, if we're at mile 20 and we're flirting with the orange zone and seeing periods of red, that is a bad sign. That's effectively the simple answer is
Yep.
We want to see on a 100-mile ride. We don't want to see red. We want to see all green, maybe some periods of decreased oxygen. But the orange and red is going to be our big worry.
Okay. So you often hear in training that you only have so many matches, right? So it's a common term in cycling. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but basically if you're doing an effort, you only have so many really hard matches that you can burn before the tank's empty. When you see orange or red, let's say you're doing a 100-mile mountain bike race, it's going to take you 6 hours, 10 hours, whatever the number is, and you're green. You said you don't want to see orange and red. If you're hitting orange and red, is that putting you in the hole for a long way down the race? What is that actually doing?
Yeah, so we are familiar with the term and with the matches, and I couldn't exactly correlate how much time in the red and orange would equal, say, one match.
Okay.
But that's exactly the idea. Are you gonna be unable to complete the race because you went into the red zone a little bit going up a small hill? No, you're probably going to be fine. I think the more important way is to think about kind of the bookkeeping this over time. And is 5 seconds in the orange really going to do me in? Is that, the equivalent of me having lit and thrown out a match? Probably not. But I couldn't exactly put my finger on, exactly how much time in which zones would equal that match. But that's exactly the way to think about it.
Okay, but if I got my head down for a 10-mile section and I'm all orange, I probably got to think about what I'm doing.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. All right. Is there anything that muscle oxygen can tell us about fueling and nutrition when racing?
I think implicitly through our thoughts about, the energy systems. If we're in a race, if we're, relying on glucose and glycogen, and we're seeing that reflected by the corresponding expected kind of oxygen depletion that we'd see, that might give us some insight there. But it's something that we've maybe refined a little bit less than some of the other aspects we've been talking about today. But that's a fascinating area for the future, which is, now that we have this new information, what are all of the new things that we're going to be able to say? And, I think that's what we're excited about for the future and where we see a lot of progress already happening. And keep in mind, I don't personally have a strong background in physiology, and some of our users out there, and I'm sure your listeners as well, some of these people have PhDs in physiology, and they're out there working all this and figuring it out. And what it's going to be is a matter of us to ultimately, get that same level of understanding and build it into the product. because that would be the amazing future, in that all of the things that we're talking about are completely seamlessly built into the product and the experience. And at the end of a ride, instead of maybe having to do a little bit of that manual interpretation like we've been discussing, that the platform, that the app, the software can tell you everything you need to know, and maybe even start getting into that territory where we can infer some things about dietary needs, nutrition, and potentially even being able to prescribe some of that to the user. But
Okay.
I think we still have a little bit of hard work to do before we get there.
Okay. And then if you're using muscle oxygen, I guess the question becomes, can you get rid of power and heart rate while training and racing? Can you eliminate those and effectively just use muscle oxygen?
I wouldn't say that. And of course, if I said throw out your power meter, I think your listeners and everybody else around the world would come and hunt me down.
They might.
We kind of got back to in the beginning. If we're thinking about a population, the general population of deconditioned individuals, there might be a case to make. And again, it seems like some of this new data that we're starting to see might be, hey, if you had to pick one or the other, that muscle oxygen may be preferred over heart rate. But I think for all of the levels that especially, your listeners are operating at, and a lot of our customers as well, more data is better. And heart rate monitors, for example, they're prolific, they're cheap. Power meters are getting cheaper. And I think now the important thing is, rather than saying, hey, should I choose one versus the other, but given all of this information, how can I actually leverage it and make sure we don't get into this trap of accumulating data for the sake of accumulating data. And that's something that we've always kept kind of core, is making sure that our acquisition and collection, and providing this data, that we don't get ahead of our ability to turn that into a useful outcome for the user. So as long as we can do that, I would say, hey, let's keep the heart rate monitor, let's keep the power meter, and really focus on what kind of amazing insights can we glean from that, and to what extent can we better prescribe, workout protocols, recovery, and things like that for the future.
Okay. I probably should have asked this question at the beginning, but I guess I saved it for the end. What is the device? How do you wear it? I know, but explain it to the listeners, how the device is used on your body.
Yeah, great question. So the device itself, I think at the beginning we mentioned, it's an optical sensor. So it's non-invasive. It's, it's maybe a little bit bigger than the face of your Garmin watch. It has an elastic band, not unlike, your chest strap heart rate monitor. And the product is designed to be worn around the thigh. And the reason for that is that a lot of the people that we're targeting are people like runners, cyclists, and rowers, where the legs, the quads, things like that, it's a very lower body dominant sorts of activities. And the product is perfect for that. And a lot of people asked us, and actually in the beginning as we were developing the technology, the biggest worry that we had was not whether we could nail down the science and collect the data and analyze it. None of these were the questions. The questions were, if we're making a technology, that the value is when this sensor is placed on the working muscle, can we ask people who are running, in some cases, 100-mile races, and they're chafing in places that normal people don't chafe, Can we ask them to strap something around their leg and run with it for 100 miles? And we have been incredibly surprised in that has been a non-issue.
Okay, I was going to ask you that. Is it comfortable?
Yeah, it has been, I would say, a non-issue. That has been the most surprising thing to us. Is that, again, even if we had made an amazing sensor and the data was the best in the world and all of these things, which we have been able to do, if nobody wanted to wear the product because it was scratching them or bothering them after a mile, then, we're no use to anybody. But
yeah, what's the point? Exactly.
We had people, running the Double Boston Marathon for the last couple of years, wearing even back to some of our early prototypes, and they'd come home and forget they're even wearing it.
Okay. Your biggest competitor, I would guess, is Moxie. Is that a fair assessment?
They're certainly another player in this space, but okay. We consider the biggest competitor the status quo. The challenge that we both face collectively is educating the world about muscle oxygen and the value that it has. And that has been really the biggest challenge, is just market education. I'm sure your users or your listeners are incredibly smart. They're out there online, they're reading a lot, they're on the forums, they're reading the blog posts. And, that's the same sort of people that we run into places like Interbike and the, marathon expos and stuff like that.
Yep.
But it's still, we have a ways to go to get muscle oxygen to be kind of a household name.
Okay.
So that's really, I think, the bigger battle that we're all fighting here.
Okay. And you don't have to compare and contrast yourself to Moxie if you don't want to. Understand that. But if you are able to, is there much difference between you and Moxie or not?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, the metric is the same. We're both looking to measure muscle oxygen. The focus, again, that I mentioned before has been on our ability to process and digest the data and make it actionable for the user. And that, I think, is something that we've been able to provide with a lot of success that hadn't been available previously. And again, that's the ongoing focus for the future. And if we think about really the future value of what we want to do, let's say in the event that 10 other players come into the market and make muscle oxygen sensors, and the price goes down and they become more available and all that, we want to have the value that we provide in our ability to interpret and process that information. Because at the end of the day, I can give you the sensor, and if I took all the colors away, all the analytics, and everything that our software and app provides, chances are, unless you're really motivated, you have a PhD in physiology, and you're willing to put the time in and read and understand, you're going to wear it and say, another squiggly line in my, in one of my many charts in Training Peaks or, Garmin Connect or whatever it might be.
Yep.
And then you're going to stop using the product and, go back to just training the way you were.
Okay. All right. We ask every guest this question. It's called our Watt Point question. And the idea is, if the listener follows the advice or uses the product that was discussed on the show, how many watts is that worth to their FTP? Now, I know this is a hard question. It's a loaded question. You may not have an exact answer, but we're just looking for a ballpark. So we always use a cyclist with a 300 watt FTP. So the question in this case would be, if somebody has been training without muscle oxygen, and then they add muscle oxygen to their training, and I'll give you a year, how many watts do you think that is worth after a year?
You're right. It's a hard question. I mean, I would say definitely we'd hope to see in the, assuming that they've exhausted, kind of all the traditional options and things
Correct.
Like that.
Yep.
And there's not some low-hanging fruit. I would hope to definitely see on the order of 10% or more.
Wow. That's awesome. Okay, very cool.
But
awesome.
That's data we're that's the sort of data we're capturing now, and we'll see.
Interesting. Okay, and just so I know, what is it about muscle oxygen that you can't get with power or heart rate that can give you that 10%? Is it just a more you're able to more specifically hit those targeted zones, or what is it?
It's training the physiological limitation. If you've been out there and you've been using your heart rate and not understanding that the underlying problem that you have is your muscles' ability to use that oxygen, and you're out there training in the way that we were discussing before, to as if you had an oxygen supply problem, there could be a huge potential for improvement.
Yeah. Okay, that's understood. Perfect. All right. So how do people learn more about your product? How do they get it? Where can they go to get this product and learn more about it?
And I'll pass this one off to Alessandro if he wants to chime in.
You can, we sell them online through our website. So if you go on HUMON.io, you'll be able to buy it. We ship in nearly all countries. It costs $295 to get the full system. You get access to all the mobile apps, a web app as well. We have the Garmin apps. We compare it to some Wahoo bike computers. And so you just go online and it ships, within a day.
Okay. And as far as battery life, it's just a replaceable battery. Do you charge it? How long does it last?
So It's a rechargeable battery, so you don't have to worry about carrying on some AA's or something like that.
Okay.
The product charges wirelessly, so it ships with a little custom charging puck that the product just sits perfectly in at the end. I think we advertise on the website now something like 18 hours of battery life. But to be honest, we so grossly over-engineered it that the battery life is in practice much more than that, to the point where we've never even bothered really going back and refining that because it's been a non-issue. I think most people just I don't think anyone has ever run the battery out.
Over-engineering and MIT don't go hand in hand, right? Not at all?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, that's the perfect place to engineer. Okay, well, cool, guys. This is a really interesting episode. It's something that I really knew nothing about before looking into it, and I did some research, but I've learned so much more just by talking to you guys on the show today. So thank you for that. I think the listeners are really going to take a lot from this as well, and I hope we can get some people using muscle oxygen and see how it helps them.
We hope so as well. And, thanks again for having us. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
Hey, this is Chris with FLO. When we're not producing this podcast, our team at FLO is designing some of the fastest carbon fiber bicycle wheels in the world. As a thank you for being a listener of our podcast, Faster by FLO, we wanted to offer you 20% off your next purchase of wheels at flowcycling.com. Head over to our website and pick up a set of wheels to make you faster at your next race or ride. Simply use coupon code PODCAST, that's PODCAST, in all uppercase letters when checking out to get 20% off your order. Thanks again for listening to Faster. We hope you enjoy the show. Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to listen to episode 34, where we interview Jeff Byers, the co-founder of HUMON and manufacturer of PR Lotion. During this episode, we'll discover how PR Lotion's patented absorption technology provides your body with an essential electrolyte that will help you become a faster cyclist. If you enjoyed the show, please help us by sharing our podcast and by leaving a rating or review. If you want to learn more about our company, FLO Cycling, please visit us online at flowcycling.com. That's F as in Frank, LOCYCLING.com. You can also find us under FLO Cycling on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, ride safe.